just want to be clear that this is a non-technical talk, so if anybody'd like to leave right now, they can.
So, well, seriously, this is like the third Dev Days I'm visiting, and usually it was, I don't know, I felt myself like a black sheep, because there are like all these developer talks, and I'm coming like, oh yeah, I understand what you're talking, but literally, we just want to bring some UX to Dev Days, and I think we can do it. So, yeah, let us introduce ourselves.
So I'm Dorothy Shamonsky. I lead the UI UX R&D efforts at ICS.
And I'm Andrew Babkin. I'm a senior UX designer at ICS, and we've been working with Dorothy for a long time, like 5 years, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So today we just want to share our experience of working with developers and how we succeed in that.
So we mind the gap at ICS. You're going to have to move that. So just if you're not familiar with ICS, just quickly, ICS is the largest independent source of Qt expertise in North America, and we just expanded and opened an office in Denmark. We try to blend art, engineering, and technology to build powerful, user-friendly applications, and we just doubled the size of our UX team this year at ICS. So the name comes from the campaign in the London subway system to be careful of the gap between the train and the platform, which at times can be so large that a person can actually fall through it. It's a metaphor for how to get from UX specs to implementation without falling in a hole or without losing a chunk of the design. Now, maybe the gap between UX spec and implementation is more like a canyon, and maybe your bridge is a broken down rope bridge. So in this presentation, we're going to share some of our knowledge and hopefully share how we build a structurally sound bridge between UX and development. This talk is also not platform specific or not language specific, although many of the examples that you're going to see are done in Qt and QML. So there's a lot of attention to details in achieving a good UX, and so we also mind the details. But to achieve a good UX, there's a large paradigm shift that in thinking and behavior that I think developers really need to go through, and that is the notion of UX first. So we also mind the priorities, and this concept of UX first has so many good implications for creating better UX. It can mean make UX your priority. It can mean design the user experience first and then implement. It can also mean implement the user experience before you do the back end, so that it's possible to review the UX as you progress and also have enough time to refine it. So you'll see how this plays out as we go through the talk. So today we're going to talk about the science of collaboration, the art of spec reading and writing, philosophy of patterns, and theory of ownership. And hopefully along the way you'll get some questions answered that we often hear from developers, such as why do designers always change their mind? Why are specs never done? Do I really have to tweak pixels? And I own the code, so why don't I own the UX? We have written 4 scenarios, and they're based on our real-life UX experiences. We've changed names to protect the innocent, and so we're going to act out a little scenario before each section. So collaboration.
Yeah, so we're gonna play out a little scene for you.
Okay, I can come over here. So I'm the designer, right? Okay, so
I'm a developer right now.
So this was a project where there was just one designer, one developer, and And as the designer, I did originally introduce the specs to the developer. But since there were just two of us, we didn't set up any formal meetings or anything. So after a week, I seek out the developer. Hi, can I see any progress?
No, nothing is ready. Just getting started, you know.
Okay, another week goes by. Hi there, how are you doing? Can I see any progress?
No, actually, there's nothing to see yet because I have to do a lot of backend stuff first.
All right, another week goes by. Hey, can I see any progress?
Well, you know, the backend stuff I mentioned earlier, I just need to refactor that code.
Okay. Fourth week goes by. How you doing? Can I see any progress?
Hi. No, it's really not ready yet.
You know, I really want to see something before you think you're done, because, I mean, you must have some little bit of anything that I can see.
Well, trust me, Dorothy, there is nothing to look at yet.
Okay, a fifth week goes by. Hey, can I see any progress?
Yes, you know, I am ready to show you. Look.
Hey, yeah, that's nice. You've made some great progress, but gee, you changed some of the things in the design, that doesn't really work that well. Okay, well, you know, this is great, but we'll need to refine some of these things.
Well, I'm sorry, but changing that is not possible without a huge amount of rework. We really don't have time and budget to do that now. I think we're pretty much done with this project.
So, would anybody like to venture comments about what they think was positive or negative in that scenario? Anybody?
So nothing wrong with that story? Every day?
Was it right? Was it good?
I can come up to anybody who want to share. You want to share? Okay.
Presumably the developer would have had at least some work in progress UX he was using to test the functionality that he could have shared at a much earlier time.
Yeah, you would have thought.
Yes. Yeah, that's the plan. So that not like meet, UI designer cannot meet with developer in the end and just say, okay, this is what we got. Nothing can do about that. We just need to meet frequently. Yeah, that's what we need. All right, so should we move on?
Well, so the outcome of that project was not very successful, and maybe the really clear message there is just that if you can't see anything, you can't review it. You can't see if the progress is good or if the developer doesn't understand what the spec is trying to convey. So up front, seeing anything visual up front is good. That process was a little similar to what we often call throwing the specs over the cubicle wall, where the UX designer makes the specs and then throws them over the wall and never talks, never sees them again. That's they're out of the project. And so we were obviously advocating for the opposite of that kind of interaction. So when people talk about collaborating, usually they focus on things like respect each other, communicate, etc. I saw this quote and I was kind of intrigued by it. Filmmaking is a miracle of collaboration, and I couldn't help but put in UX and think about UX could be a miracle of collaboration. But what's the miracle? What's the magic of collaboration? And my thoughts on that are that the magic of collaboration is the structure of collaboration. It's setting up a structure. People are inherently lazy, and if you leave it up to them to decide when they're going to meet or to initiate any kind of discussion between engineer and UX, UX designers are lazy too. But if up front, if you set up a structure and it's a structure that people feel good about and can agree on, at least somewhat, then what happens is the collaboration just occurs. If you put two people in a meeting together and you say, any questions, questions will come out. And so that has worked really well for us. So just, we usually have kickoff meetings where the UX designers explain the specs, and then we set up regular meetings, usually once a week, but it depends on the project. I mean, every project has its own kind of needs, so you have to really do this on a project basis. We also put tasks, divide the work into tasks and then set the tasks up in some kind of spreadsheet or project management software, and then we assign tasks, and then we mark tasks off when they're done, and it seems to work really well. But to me, here's the clincher: is how you slice up the work really makes a difference. That you slice it up makes a difference, and how you slice it up makes a difference. So here's how I think about it: is the old style of creating an interface was you basically do the whole back end, and then you put on this little layer of UX at the end. The new style is that the UX is much more robust. It's bigger, basically, a lot more code. So you have this much bigger chunk of code that you need to deal with. And what we found is, in pretty universally in every development process, the first 1/3, if you think about this as time coming across, the first 1/3 is the most interesting, exciting part. Everybody's excited to get started. You're doing the large general pieces. That's fun. And then you get to the second third, and it gets harder because you got to really start making things work, and that's when the bugs start to show up. And then you get to the end of the 2/3, and at that point, okay, some people want to be done. That last 1/3 is really crucial. If you don't go there, then you're not going to polish your UX. That last 1/3, that's where Apple goes. That's where Google's going now. That's where Microsoft wants to go. So I would say from our experience, a lot of times after the first 2/3, there's some nasty bugs, and people never make it there because of those nasty bugs. Or, other things came up, and then time and money has run out. Or it's not that uncommon that someone on the team, even product managers will do this, where they'll say, let's really add this other functionality instead of doing the polish on the UX, because doesn't it seem more valuable to have this added functionality? So then they won't do the polish, and they'll go and they'll add more functionality. Again, you're not going to get a really good UX unless you go there. And I know it is painful, and people will do anything not to go there. But you got to do it. That's the hard lesson. So in terms of, this is like just the whole idea of, if you're going to divide up a piece of UX, there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is you do a mini version of the whole UX, or a simplified version of the entire UX, like the little app for what's going to be the big app in the end. And then once you get the little app working, then you go to doing the larger versions of it. Or sometimes it makes more sense to slice it. But the key idea is that for every little app or every slice, you really need to go back and go through all three parts of this. The idea is that you're polishing the small pieces of the UX before you're actually to the end point. So you take your first slice and you go through all three parts of this. And that also will prevent you from getting into that position of you're at the last 1/3 and you find any excuse to not polish. It also somehow, there's a kind of a magic to it where it somehow allows you to find issues and problems that you might not have found otherwise if you were doing the UX as a whole chunk and not getting to that real polish until the end. So it's really worked for us. Okay, specifications.
Right. Yeah. So we're moving on, and another topic we want to talk about is specifications, which is very important because you cannot develop an application without specs. So this is my, mine now. Okay. We know. Recently, we were working on a project, and after a couple of weeks, we submitted a lot of UX bugs. And it turned out there are really a lot of them. So this is what, developers said.
Your specs are not good.
But what's the problem?
They have too many holes, and I can't get the UX the way that you want it because the specs are not complete enough. Every time I implement something, you tell me to fix it, but I don't know what it's supposed to be to begin with.
Well, if you ask me, I can provide you with any missing information.
Why do I have to ask? Why can't you provide it up front?
Well, it's because I don't always know what you want or need until you tell me. So this is another situation which usually happens. And, well,
maybe it's obvious what's wrong with that.
Yeah, looks
Give
like.
me that hat.
Yeah, but I'm still a designer right now. Well, Edward Burrard once said that working on war and developing software from a specification are easy if both are frozen. Yeah, looks like everybody after reading this quotation remember their own story, right? So, and I know that somewhere reading specs, somewhere writing specs, and sometimes it turns out that the developer and designer are separated by this invisible wall. They kind of, they can communicate, but they don't. They have the specs, and this is like the only communication they have. And the truth is that you cannot see the project, only by reading the UX specs. You have to communicate, and that's why we think, designers and developers should be together always and communicate through like the project from day one till the last day. So it doesn't mean that some just write specs and other are just trying to implement no matter what. No, actually there are no parties in this process. There's only one team and one goal, and the question of perfect specs is very much relevant. So, and perfect specs has a direct impact on the final product. But writing a complete UI specs is very time-consuming, and usually there is not enough time allotted to spec writing, unless you work for Apple, of course. But and usually there is not enough time for design process at all. And usually specs are written simultaneous to a project being designed, which is not good. And it means that sometimes first documents created are not in sync with the documents created in the end of the project. And there is basically no time to sync these documents. This will be the wasting of time. And the reality is that designers usually get like 1/4 or 1 out of 10, the amount of time they really need to create UX specs. And reality is that good specs take time, which we eventually don't have. Especially resources are usually limited. But, that's why you cannot start design before the implementation. We, usually need at least 2 weeks. The design team to start developing specs, and only then developers can step in and work. So what are the perfect specs? Well, I think the unified answer to this question just doesn't exist. Ideal specs are defined by the project needs, deadlines, and people. And saying people, I mean the UX team and developers all together, how well they communicate and solve issues. UX designer trying to, write specs, the designer should care about the developer who is going to read these specs, because this is what they have to work with. And developer should be respectful to the work done by the designer. And what's very important, be attentive to details. Details always matter, and these are the bricks UI is made of. And omitting some details can never make the UX complete, because the user interface is a system. You take one piece out and it's already broken. So, but don't get me wrong, like specs are never the law which developers should follow. It's more like a dialogue between designer and developer, and this dialogue ends only when the product is released, goals are reached, and everybody's happy. And it's obvious that developers have a better point of view on implementing challenging features. Their decisions and proposals can have a big impact on a project. They can save a lot of time for developers. And UI team should always be open for discussion. But we shouldn't forget the ownership, that the UX team should still own the UX and developers should own the code. But we'll talk about that a bit later. So this is like a small illustration how UX specs can look like. So in the very beginning of the project, you just go a very lightweight, and you just provide specs which are needed to, to start the project, to do the very basic features and stuff. And then you start putting additional layers to the specs. These could be project requirements and some additions required by the technology, by developers. Those could be new features proposed and so on. So, and in the end, you get your perfect specs, but only for your project. This is like, you cannot apply it for another project, of course. And just to show you the example, I'm going to talk about the software, which is like the in-house project at ICS, which we develop when we have time. And this is, it's called Topics. This powerful list management software where you can manage your projects. You can manage like what things you need to buy, and this is just lists. And we have versions for the desktop as well as for mobile platforms. So we started with the desktop version, and it was good that we had like 2 weeks to develop the UI specs. And so we had a set of mockups, main mockups. We developed the look and feel we want to follow. We provided flowcharts. We made graphical assets, explained the behavior, spec'd out sizes of fonts, of all the space and colors and so on. And basically, by the start of the development team, we had a pretty detailed spec document. And so what it all allowed us to be very accurate in implementation, as well as like we had all these UI kickoff meetings and UI review meetings every week. And so what you see on top, this is like the markup, and at the bottom, this is like already working application. And so except for the content, these are identical, like 98%, I'd say. So it was a success, and the key thing here was, well, a good team, of course, like that we have those 2 weeks in advance to work on specs and on design. So, and the next platform we were developing it is Windows 8. But here, since it's an in-house project at ICS, so we didn't have enough time to make the same specs, but we managed to provide for the development team, all the mockups of the main screens. We made this flowchart showing how everything works, and of course, like we did mind the gap by Windows 8 specifications, because on Windows 8 you're pretty strict on on the layout and fonts and all this stuff. And also, we did mind this gap by very good communication in a team. It's like like every day and every time, like developer could ask me a question, and like I have an answer to that always. And you just cannot put all the answers to all the questions to the spec, because you don't know what questions will come up. So then we applied the same approach to the Android version, and well, development is still in progress, but it's going pretty good. So, and what I have to admit that this approach was working like on 3 different development teams. And so does it mean that developers are more comfortable with graphical mockups than written specs? Well, again, the answer is yes and no, because yes, if a developer can work with a graphical mockup only, if developer can really read the mockup to see all the details, then yes, you can go mostly with graphical content. But we all know that sometimes a very strict text is good to understand. So you just have you need to have a perfect balance of graphic and text content in a spec document. But never forget that all the spec require additional communication, and mockups should be literally read too, as well as text. So, but unfortunately, every spec document is unique, as well as every project is. But, well, you should write good specs and read them just the way you wrote it. So, we move on to the next part.
New scenario. I'm the designer.
Okay. I'm a developer.
Okay. How come these 12 dialogues, which are all supposed to match, don't?
Well, there were 12 dialogues, and Ed and I divided them in half. So he did 6, and I did 6.
Did you share the code base for the dialogues?
Oh, no. We did them completely differently. We have really, different styles of coding. And I think we can make them look similar.
Well, they need to look identical in fonts and spacing, except for the actual content of the dialogue. They need to have the same behavior as well. I think you definitely need to share the code base for that.
Well, I think we can make them work with what we have so far.
Okay, after several weeks, the dialogues still don't match.
Oh, we're still working on those.
Several more weeks pass. What's happening with the dialogues?
Well, one of us is going to rewrite them so that they all look the same.
Told you so. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a room of developers, Dorothy.
Said that to myself. So, what are patterns? UX patterns. User interface design patterns are used as a solution to reoccurring design problems. I'm always surprised that developers don't seem to look for patterns in UX designs. And even though user experience design has to accommodate users, and users seem to be totally idiosyncratic, designers actually design using interface patterns which are completely rule-based. And I guess here's one way that I think about it, is that it's confusing and annoying to live in a world where there are no rules or inconsistent rules. And I think about dreams as kind of being like that kind of world where you can go through a door and you're in the same room that you started out in, or you try to run and you're still in the same place. And so apps are kind of the same way, even little phone apps. It's like if the rules are confusing, the rules of behavior, then it's frustrating to use it. So so I think of patterns as building blocks to an interface, kind of like Legos. And patterns can also be multi-level. They don't have to just be on one level. So in this case, you recognize an iPhone. There's an edit pattern, which, the edit button's usually in the top bar, and then inside the edit pattern is a delete pattern. So the delete's always at the bottom of the edit contact. The delete button is always consistent. So the significant thing about patterns is that they translate or can translate directly into components or into widgets or into some form of reusable code. The origin of patterns is not coming out of the world of UX. There's actually a seminal 1970s design text by architect Christopher Alexander called A Pattern Language. And then he had a companion book called A Timeless Way of Building. And in that book, he described a multi-layer pattern language richly interconnected and grounded in the human understanding of the constructed world. Well, in the 1990s, a book called Design Patterns by Gamma, Helms, Johnson, and Vasides described object-oriented microarchitectures and essentially introduced software engineers to the concept of software design patterns. So UX patterns really grew directly out of that kind of thinking. And so again, I'm always expecting developers to be looking for those patterns, but it seems as if they don't realize that we actually design that way. So the value of patterns for users is that it limits the amount of different items, or it creates consistency of look and behavior within an application, so easier to learn and understand. Many patterns are known across platforms, and so, for instance, here's an example of tabs. Tabs are used to represent a lot of information on one particular page. And then again, patterns can translate directly into software components. So the specification of a design pattern it goes deeper into the actual details that can include color specification, font specification, the actual pixel size of any given element on a page. And so this is actually an example of Andrew and I trying to figure out a way of pulling the specifications out of a mockup into a spreadsheet in hopes of making it easier to create style sheets or styles within a Qt app, because using styles really makes maintaining consistency in the patterns much easier. So what's key here is that developers learn to recognize patterns. And then here, this is topics again, the same application, using, showing the message to the user, a little message to the user as a repeating pattern. And what's the clincher is that what we find is on teams where there's more than one developer is the communication about the patterns or about the reusable code or about the components is sometimes a problem. So, as you can see in this diagram, like the patterns go across the entire UX. But if you've divided your development work into modules or into slices, then it's really important for the developers to all be on the same page in terms of how they're representing those patterns. Okay, ownership.
All right. So, yeah. So we're gonna play out another scene. This time it's about ownership. Okay, don't worry about it. All right.
Okay.
Now I'm gonna be a designer.
Yeah, I'm the developer. I needed to add a new feature, and I didn't want to bother you. So I just cut and pasted some of the graphics from another part of the app. I thought it turned out pretty well.
Okay. I can make some new assets for that new section. This looks like crap.
It's okay. I'm pretty proud of what I did.
It's not really consistent or up to the same quality level as the other parts.
Oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it. I have a bunch of bugs I have to fix. I'll see you later.
Yeah. So what happens here is that well, sometimes it's wrong when developers make design decisions.
Really?
Yes. I'm trying to be polite here. So, well, ownership is pretty easy thing to understand, right? It's like just do your own thing. Like so, managers kind of own the overall project. They make all the decisions related to that. The developer owns the integrity of the code. UI UX designer owns the UI UX design. Graphic designer owns the graphic design, and so on. So it kind of sounds easy. Sometimes this creates so many problems, and just in the end, you don't get the product you expected to have, and everybody is in a bad situation. So designers are feeling embarrassed that what they've done doesn't look the way it was supposed to, and developers see that even if they wrote like a perfect code ever, you just cannot see it through the bad UI implementation. And so as topics as our example project here. So this is the mockup of topics for Mac, and well, this is the mockup of topics for PC. So it's like when we started that. We made these mockups and we got pulled to another project, and developers were doing it by their own, and for some reason they were afraid to ask us or something, and we resulted into this, which doesn't, well, you can see that these you can on the top right there are 3 buttons taken from Mac, but this is the Windows implementation. And they took some icons from internet because
That one's mine.
you see, you found your work. Yeah, so this is what happened, and it's just in the end of this, nobody's happy, and the quality of the code was very hard to understand, and the overall impression was messed up by the bad UI implementation. So if you invest in ownership, it will return with a high quality product at the end. And this is just a great way to narrow down that gap we're talking about. And if we get back to that bridge in the beginning, we can see the building blocks of this bridge. These are things we talked about, collaboration. So you just have, if just to describe how collaboration benefits to you is like, so you should have UI kickoff meetings frequently, like in kickoff, I mean in the beginning. Then weekly UI review meetings where you can sign off on implementation by pieces, by little parts, so that in the end you don't have to deal with a huge amount of UX bugs. And of course you need a constant dialogue between developer and designer. So another building block is ownership, we just talked about. Okay, now I want to say, specs. So just keep this perfect balance between huge amount of text and images. And remember, you just need to meet project needs. And mockup is more explicit than text. And of course, user stories is a good thing, where one short line you can explain one feature, and like imagine yourself as a user, which helps a lot. Patterns, well, basically every UI element you see in the mockup should be the same component over and over again. You should be lazy. You don't rewrite the code, share it, and make reusable code where it's possible. And of course, use styles for that. And ownership, as we just talked about, the UX team owns the UX and sign-offs on the UX implementation on every part of it. And development team owns the code and makes all the related decisions. So guys, thank you for your attention. It was very fun. So questions and comments? All right, I'm gonna pass you the mic, okay?
Thank you. Question concerning the topic of mockups. I read it now a lot, or heard it. The first time I ever heard of QML and Qt, I think it read on the website something like, the great idea behind this, you take like your Photoshop template from the designer, that's the actual UI we'll provide. They had some beta converter, and it was exactly about bridging that gap. Now, that was like a couple of years ago, and I feel like it didn't really go into that direction. Is this something you see feasible at all, that the designer really builds, at least in a certain way, part of the actual UI instead of doing mockups?
Well, I know what you're talking about. I think there was a plugin which you could put in Photoshop,
thing,
and then you kind of export a ready QML. Well, I've been working with that, and I think it was like 2 years ago, and I did give my feedback about that. What we did is that there was a project we had IVI demo, and we literally did the project like in 1 week, because I just exported those graphic assets as like QML file and all the graphic assets. Well, it's a good thing to work with, but as a result, it's just me. I don't know. Maybe the plugin was not working right. It's just it didn't look identical, and of course, every layer was just the object in QML, and you couldn't interact with it. Like to do to reuse it later. It's like if you take the same mockup and export it, it was just hard to use. You want an objection?
Simplistic. It was too simplistic. It didn't actually address
the actual needs, in terms of workflow.
And had they maybe gone farther with the plugin and developed it more and more, maybe it could have had potential, but it didn't get developed.
Yeah, you just should take a mic.
Yeah.
It's working. No?
Yes. Advice?
Sure.
Try a little bit of QML. It's really, really easy.
I know.
So yeah, and you can do anything, and then you don't need the UX specs. Really.
Well, it's just not every project is in QML, but
no, but it's for the exams. I don't want to start a discussion, but it's for the purpose of doing the mockup. It's just an interactable mockup.
Yeah, I know. I see what you mean. It's like.
No, we've done a little QML. I think what we have more a problem with is dealing with keeping all the on a large team. We use Git, and then it gets into this whole thing of like keeping the code up to date and having to use Git. And it's almost like we then become developers, and we're losing the time that it takes actually to be it's like we're saving developer time. We're not really saving that much UX time. But what I find most successful is sometimes the idea of once the UX is to a certain point, going in and tweaking the QML is useful. And sometimes I'll sit with a developer and I just look over their shoulder and I'll say, try this, try that, because I have maybe like I have enough graphic programming background to be able to look at the QML and more quickly figure out what they should change. But I think there's value, there's certainly value in the designers doing something with QML.
Other questions?
Yeah, we have.
Okay, I don't know how to put this, but what I would like to to stop writing those specs. It's not that like the way we're working now is like someone is writing specs, and then they go to the coders and they decide to usually implement this, and it's all backwards. It needs to be more like what you see is what you get editor, and I don't see that Qt is there now. So back later when you had Flash, UX people can work in Flash, for example, but Qt is not there yet. So is there any path forward in this? Where I've been working in project with Flash, and we created Flash players for from C++, with really good output. So, but the problem is now that there's no UX people who can work in Qt. As you say, you become a developer, and we should somehow meet somewhere.
Well, one argument against it is that there's actually value for the designers in making specs, in that, as Andrew said earlier, when we start to design, we're making specs in a sense. And there is a beginning stage of the design when it's more valuable to be working in something that's faster than QML. Like, I mean, a lot of times we start with paper. With pencil on paper is the first thing that we do. So there is that beginning process where you're just designing, and then you get into Photoshop, and so then we're actually making the specs, but we're designing at the same time that we're making the specs, and so it's valuable because we can change the design quickly.
Yeah, but the problem here is that the designer is designing everything, doing everything once, and then they go and write everything down in specs on the paper, and they go to the programmers, and we try to do exactly what they did already. I think that's stupid.
You know, it is to an extent, and I guess to talk a little bit about Flash is one of the great things about QML is its animation capability, and so we can't really represent that in Photoshop, and so the Flash is valuable in that sense, even though Flash is really time consuming, and you know, creating Flash mockups is a huge amount of time. But it would be really great to have a way of doing animation mockups quickly, and we're completely lacking that. We're always just, you know, imagining them and verbalizing them and experimenting. But as someone who's done some programming myself, I really think that to some extent, the separation between designer and developer is good, in that you can each, to me it's a little bit like lawyers, where you can focus on your own client and support them in a way. And when you're designing in Photoshop, you're free of the limitations. And at first that's good. I mean, I realize then later on you have to actually deal with the limitations. But yeah, it's an imperfect world.
Yeah, it's just all those technology limitations sometimes limit your creativity, and you just first have to be free, and only then you try to find this middle part where you lose some maybe nice looking things, but you'll get this implemented right, and it's really working. Okay, we have a mic right there. Yeah.
Okay, my question is, all your scenes were biased towards the designer. And the developers were always the unprofessional ones. Now, seriously speaking, I'd like to know, in your experience, how much this is true? I mean, do you always find this kind of problem in speaking to developers? And if it's true, do you think it's a problem of sort of education, of practicing? It's something like it's not so widespread, this practice of splitting the roles between designers and developers still need to learn methods, practices, patterns.
I guess I think it's that developer, there's the old stereotype. It's like developers develop for themselves or for other engineers. It's that whole problem of not being able to understand the naive user. And so in some respects, the bad behavior is all about trying to move developers into that realm of spending more time making something user friendly and beautiful and all those kind of things that make a great UX is a kind of attention that developers generally don't care to spend that much time in. It's more detailed, it's less technical, it's less challenging technically, so it's forcing them to go into this area that's not as interesting to them as some of the other areas. So I think in that sense that's where the resistance is of always like, you got to go here, and people don't want to go there. Did that answer the question? Was there another part, or I feel like there was another part to it. Now I'm spacing on it.
Well, I think I have something to say there. It's like all these scenes we have here. It's not, it's not that we're showing that how bad developers are. We actually, we're talking about problems, right? So we're talking about how to mine this gap, which is a problem. So that's why we're trying to understand the problem, and then we give a solution to that. But I don't think that it's not the problem of education or something. It's maybe it's just that we all people, and implementing a good UX in a team means like having very good communication between each other, and not just through text and images. Maybe that's the problem. And sometimes people are comfortable to work with the backend, and some people like to implement UX. It all depends, what you like.
Okay, got one more question. Okay, in the absence of questions, I'd ask you all to show your appreciation, please, to Dorothy and Andrew.